It is the night of the 24th of July 1943. Above the city of Hamburg, 396 British heavy bombers are forming up for the largest air raid the world has ever seen. In one of them, a Lancaster 49 squadron, a 20-year-old air gunner named Eric Lewis is sitting in the rear turret scanning the night sky behind his aircraft for German fighters. He has been told that German night fighters always attack from behind and slightly above. He has been told to watch for tracer fire coming at him from a high 6 o'clock position. He has been told this by every gunnery instructor in Bomber Command. He has been told this for a year. Eric Lewis is about to die. His aircraft is going to explode in the next 40 seconds. He's going to be killed by 2 German cannon shells fired from beneath his Lancaster, not behind it, by an aircraft that he never saw, that no Lancaster crew had ever survived seeing, that the entire British Air Ministry refused to believe existed until the war was nearly over. The cannons that killed him were mounted on a German night fighter at a 70-degree angle, pointing straight up at the belly of his bomber. They had been installed 3 months earlier by a Luftwaffe armourer named Paul Mahle, who had taken an old idea, modernised it in a workshop in eastern Germany, and given the German night fighter force a weapon that British bomber crews could not see, could not hear, and almost never survived. It was called Schräge Musik. The Germans called it jazz. The Royal Air Force called it nothing, because they did not know it was there. To understand why Paul Mahle's invention killed thousands of British and Commonwealth aircrew in the second half of the war, you have to understand what was happening over Germany at night in 1943. The Royal Air Force had committed itself, almost from the beginning of the war, to a strategy called area bombing. Heavy 4-engine bombers, the Lancaster, the Halifax, the Sterling, would fly into Germany at night in vast formations, hundreds at a time, and bomb cities. The night was supposed to be their protection. By 1941, it was already clear it was not protection enough. The Germans had built a defensive system called the Kammhuber Line, a network of radar stations, ground-controlled interception, and night fighter squadrons stretched across occupied Europe. Single-engine and twin-engine German night fighters, vectored by ground controllers, would intercept the bomber stream as it crossed the coast. They would attack one bomber at a time from behind, climbing into the bomber's slipstream and opening fire from 100 yards out. The standard Royal Air Force defensive doctrine was simple. The rear gunner watched the 6 o'clock, the mid-upper gunner watched the upper hemisphere. The pilot would corkscrew, a violent evasive manoeuvre, the instant a German fighter was sighted. This worked, in a sense. Many bomber crews survived multiple operational tours by being alert, well-drilled, and lucky. But the bomber losses were already extraordinary. By the end of 1942, Bomber Command was losing approximately 5% of its dispatched aircraft on every major operation. 5% does not sound like much. In practice, it meant that the average Bomber Command aircrewman had less than a 40% chance of surviving a full tour of 30 operations. Pause and think about that. A young man in a Lancaster crew, 20 years old on his first operation, was statistically more likely to die before completing his tour than to live to see it finished. And the losses were getting worse, not better. Aircrew were starting to ask questions. They were noticing something in the squadron messes and the debriefing rooms. Bombers were disappearing without anyone seeing them go. There were no distress calls. There were no tracers. There were no fighters reported by the gunners. Aircraft simply vanished, one moment in the bomber stream and the next in a fireball falling out of the sky. The crews who survived these attacks reported what they had seen, and what they had seen was nothing. The bombers were dying in silence. Senior officers attributed the silent losses to flak, to mid-air collisions in the dark, to fuel fires, to 100 different causes. None of those theories was correct. The bombers were dying because in a Luftwaffe workshop at Pachim Airfield in northern Germany, an obscure armourer with the rank of senior sergeant was about to install a new kind of weapon on the night fighter force, and that weapon was about to kill an entire generation of British aircrew before the British Air Ministry would admit it existed. His name was Paul Mahle, Oberfeldwebel Paul Mahle, in the formal German military ranking system. The rank translates approximately to a senior sergeant or master sergeant in the Anglo-American tradition. He was not a designer in the formal sense. He had no university degree. He was not on the staff of any of the great German aircraft manufacturers. He was a Luftwaffe armourer. His job was to mount, maintain and repair weapons on Luftwaffe aircraft. In the spring of 1943, he was assigned to Nachtjagdgeschwader 5, abbreviated to NJG-5, a night fighter unit operating out of Pachim Airfield in Mecklenburg in northern Germany. NJG-5 flew the Junkers 88C night fighter variant, a twin-engine aircraft with conventional forward-firing cannons in the nose. By the spring of 43, the unit's commanders and pilots were unhappy. Attacking a Lancaster from behind meant flying through the rear gunner's defensive fire. Even though the German pilot had the advantage, the 4.303 caliber Brownings of a Lancaster rear turret were lethal at close range, and crews were being lost in the run-in. The bombers also corkscrewed effectively. Some of the German pilots, in conversations recorded in unit logs, asked whether there was a way to attack the bomber from a position where the rear gunner could not see them. The answer turned out to be older than they realised. In the First World War, German aircraft had occasionally been fitted with upward-firing machine guns to attack British observation balloons from below. The concept of an angled gun mount firing at something above the aircraft was not new. What was new was applying it to a four-engine bomber. Paul Mahle proposed sometime in the early summer of 1943 that the unit experiment with mounting 20mm MSG/FF cannons inside the Junkers 88's fuselage, angled at approximately 70 degrees from horizontal, firing through the upper hull. He proposed the installation himself. He drew the brackets. He calculated the recoil loads. He installed the test mount on his unit's first prototype. The first installation worked on the first attempt. The cannons fired through reinforced plates in the upper fuselage of the Junkers. The gun mount was a frame welded inside the radio operator's compartment, behind the pilot. The radio operator, now also doubling as the gunner, would aim the cannons by sighting through a small reflex sight installed in the cockpit canopy, looking up at the underside of the bomber overhead. The system had no recoil mechanism beyond a simple buffer. The aircraft itself absorbed the recoil. Mahle named the installation, with characteristic German workshop humour, Schräge Musik. The phrase translates as slanted music, but, in German slang of the period, also meant jazz or off-key music. The name stuck. Now, here is what made it work. The basic problem with attacking a bomber from below is that you cannot see it from below. The pilot of a night fighter sitting in his cockpit has a view of the sky above and to the sides. He has no view of the area directly below his aircraft, and no view of the area directly above. To attack a bomber from below, the night fighter pilot has to fly underneath the bomber, hold position, aim cannons that point up, and fire. None of those things is trivial. The first problem was finding the bomber. The Junkers 88C night fighter carried a radar set called Liechtenstein, an early airborne intercept radar that could detect a four-engine bomber at a range of about 3 kilometers. The radar was mounted in the nose of the night fighter and projected a forward-facing search beam. To find a bomber, the night fighter pilot, guided by ground control to the bomber stream, would scan with his radar until he picked up a return. He would then fly toward the return, descend below the bomber's altitude, and turn underneath it. The crucial part was the descent. The German pilot had to come up behind the bomber, slide below it without being detected, match the bomber's speed and course exactly, and then settle into a position approximately 50 to 100 feet, directly underneath the target. Once in position, the bomber overhead was visible against the slightly lighter sky to the German pilot looking up. The bomber's silhouette filled the upper view of the night fighter's cockpit. The German pilot could see the four engines, the wing roots, the bomb bay, the fuselage. He could not be seen by the bomber. The rear gunner was scanning behind. The mid-upper gunner was scanning above. Neither could see down. There was no belly gunner on a Lancaster. There was a small under-fuselage astrodome through which the navigator could look, but it was rarely used in flight and even more rarely manned. The bomber was, for all practical purposes, blind to attack from directly below. Paul Mahle's cannons, once installed, would fire 2 streams of 20mm explosive shells upward through the bomber's belly. The fuel tanks were in the wings. The bomb bay was in the centre of the fuselage. The crew positions were directly above the cannon's line of fire. A single burst, properly aimed, would hit the wing fuel tanks. A bomber struck in the wing fuel tank by 20mm cannon fire at close range would catch fire almost immediately. The fire would spread through the wing in seconds. The aircraft would lose control. The crew would have at most 15 seconds to abandon the aircraft before it exploded. Most crews did not. The second engineering insight was the rate of fire. The MG/FF cannon fired at approximately 500 rounds per minute, which is to say roughly 8 rounds per second. A short burst of 1 second, 2 seconds, would put 15 to 20 cannon shells into the target's belly. The pilot did not need to be a marksman. He needed to be close, and he needed the cannon mount to be steady. The third insight, and this is where the genius of Mahle's installation became deadliest, was the tracer, or rather, the absence of tracer. The Germans deliberately loaded their MG/FF magazines with no tracer rounds at all. Standard ammunition was a mix of high explosive incendiary, armour-piercing, and tracer. For Schräge Musik, the tracer was removed. The bomber crew, even in the fraction of a second before the aircraft caught fire, would see nothing. No streaks of light, no flash. The cannon shells would impact the belly of the aircraft in total darkness. To the surviving crews in nearby bombers in the formation, the target bomber would simply explode without warning. There would be no tracer trail leading down to the German fighter. There would be no gun flash to mark the firing aircraft. The dying bomber would tumble out of the formation and fall, and the German fighter would slide out from beneath it and disappear into the night. Production began at Junkers' repair workshops and at unit-level installation in the summer of '43. Mahle's basic frame design was so simple that armourers in night fighter units could install it themselves in a few days of workshop time on existing aircraft. By the end of 1943, the Schräge Musik installation had been retrofitted to over 400 German night fighters, Junkers 88Cs, Heinkel 111 night fighter variants, Messerschmitt 110Gs, and Dornier 217s were all equipped. The most common version mounted two 20mm MG/FF cannons. Later versions mounted two MG 151 20mm cannons, which had a higher rate of fire and a more lethal shell. By the spring of 1944, the installation was standard on essentially every German night fighter operating against Bomber Command. Compare it to what the British had. The standard Royal Air Force heavy bomber defence was the 4.303 caliber Browning machine gun, 4 of them in the rear turret, 2 in the mid-upper turret, 2 in the nose. The 4.303 was a rifle caliber round. To bring down a twin-engine night fighter, a rear gunner would need to fire dozens of rounds and hit critical components. The Germans could destroy a Lancaster with a single second's burst from beneath. Pause and think about what that means. The defensive armament of the most heavily armed bomber in the Royal Air Force infantry was almost completely useless against a weapon installed for free in a workshop in northern Germany by a sergeant armourer with no engineering degree. By the end of 1943, German night fighters using Schräge Musik were killing British and Canadian bomber crews at a rate that approached panic levels in Bomber Command's planning staff. The losses were always reported as missing aircraft. Reports from crews in nearby bombers, when they survived, described the dying aircraft as exploding without apparent cause. There was no fighter visible. There was no flak. The bombers were simply gone. The biggest single demonstration of the weapon's effectiveness came in the Battle of Berlin, fought from late November of 1943 to March of 1944. Bomber Command flew 16 major raids against Berlin in that period. 2,720 Allied aircraft were lost. The crew casualties exceeded 10,000 killed or captured. A significant proportion of those losses were attributed to Schräge Musik attacks, though the British did not know it at the time. Then came the night of the 30th and 31st of March, 1944, in the operation that became known to British aircrew simply as the Nuremberg Raid. 795 Bomber Command aircraft set out to attack the city of Nuremberg. 95 did not return. Many of the losses were inflicted by night fighters using Schrage Musik. The Nuremberg Raid remains the worst single-night loss in the history of Bomber Command. 12% of the dispatched aircraft were destroyed in one night. The crews who survived to debrief reported that bombers around them had been seen exploding in mid-air without warning. They reported seeing no fighters. They reported seeing no tracer fire. They reported the same pattern over and over, and Bomber Command's intelligence officers continued for several more months to attribute most of the losses to flak. The first definitive Allied recognition of Schräge Musik came in August of '44, when a damaged Junkers 88 night fighter was forced down in Belgium with the installation intact. By that time, the war had less than 10 months left. Bomber Command had been losing crews for over a year to a weapon it had refused to believe existed. The official Royal Air Force response, when the existence of Schräge Musik was finally accepted in late '44, was to mount ventral gun positions on a small number of Lancasters and Halifaxes. The modification was never widely deployed. There were not enough installations to make a meaningful difference in the final months of the war. By the time the British had a response, the German night fighter force was itself collapsing from fuel shortages and pilot losses. The top-scoring German night fighter pilot of the war, Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, claimed 121 bomber kills, almost all of them at night. He used Schräge Musik for the majority of his later kills. His Messerschmitt 110, preserved after the war, can be seen today in the Imperial War Museum's collection at Hendon. The two upward-firing cannons are still installed. Compare that to the experience of the Lancaster crews. A typical Bomber Command operational tour was 30 raids. By the standards of the second half of 1943 and the first half of 1944, an aircrewman starting a tour had less than a 1 in 3 chance of completing it alive. Of the 55,500 Bomber Command aircrew who died in the war, a significant fraction were killed by a weapon installed in a Mecklenburg workshop by a sergeant armourer with no formal training in weapons design. Let me put you in the cockpit of a Junkers 88 Sea Night fighter over the city of Magdeburg on the night of the 21st of January 1944. You are the pilot. You are an Oberleutnant. You have been in the air for 2 hours. Your radar operator has just put you onto a Lancaster bomber of 76 Squadron, flying at 20,000 feet. You descend through 500 feet of cloud and emerge below the bomber stream. You can see the dark shape of the Lancaster above you, slightly to the east, silhouetted against the high cirrus. You match speed. You match course. You slide underneath the bomber's belly. You are now flying at 170 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, 50 feet below the Lancaster, in a position where no member of its crew can possibly see you. Your radio operator, sitting behind you, has the reflex sight of the Schrage Musik installation locked onto the underside of the bomber's port wing. He gives you a single word: aiming. You press the firing button. The 2 cannons mounted in the radio compartment behind you fire for 1.5 seconds. 40 cannon shells exit the upper fuselage of your aircraft at an angle of 70 degrees and tear through the wing root of the Lancaster above. The Lancaster's port wing fuel tank ignites. The aircraft pitches over hard. You see 1 parachute, then a second. Then the bomber explodes. You are already turning away. There are 7 men dying behind you. None of them ever saw your aircraft. None of them ever knew what hit them. Paul Mahle survived the war. He was demobilized in 1945 and returned to civilian life in northern Germany. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews. There is one photograph of him in the surviving German Air Force records, taken at Parchim in 1943, showing a man in his late 30s in a Luftwaffe ground crew uniform, leaning against the underside of a Junkers 88 with one of his upward-firing cannon installations partially visible. After the war, he worked as a mechanic in West Germany. He was never tried for any war crime. He had broken no laws. He had built a weapon that did what weapons do. The British military scientific establishment, when it finally accepted in late 1944 that Schrage Musik existed, classified the entire subject. The fact that Bomber Command had been losing crews to upward-firing cannons for over a year, while officers attributed the losses to flak and weather, was never publicly admitted during the war. The story emerged piecemeal in the official histories published in the late 1940s and the 1950s. The full scale of the weapon's contribution to British and Commonwealth aircrew deaths was not generally understood by the public until the publication of detailed academic studies in the 1970s. By that time, most of the men who had flown against it were already dead or elderly. The post-war legacy of Schräge Musik in aviation engineering is small but precise. The principle of attacking from a blind hemisphere, from an axis the target cannot see, became a foundational concept in air-to-air combat. Modern fighter doctrine still distinguishes between attacks from the target's 6 o'clock, from below, and from the high 6. The principle of mounting weapons on an axis other than the aircraft's centerline was largely abandoned after the war, with the advent of guided air-to-air missiles, but the underlying lesson, that the way to kill a target is to attack it where it cannot see you, remains the foundation of modern air combat. The Imperial War Museum at Hendon still holds Schnauffer's Messerschmitt with its cannons intact. Visitors walk past it on their way to the Spitfires and the Mosquitoes. Most of them do not look at the underside of the aircraft. They do not see the 2 short tubes pointing up out of the fuselage at a steep angle. They do not know what the tubes did. The men who knew are mostly dead. Bomber Command's worst night. The Nuremberg raid killed 745 British and Commonwealth aircrewmen in a few hours. Most of them died from cannon shells fired from below. The man who put those cannons there was a sergeant armourer in Mecklenburg. He had no idea in the spring of 43 how many men he was going to kill. By the end of the war, he had probably contributed to the deaths of more Allied aircrewmen than any single named individual on the German side except Schnauffer himself. They told the gunners to watch the 6 o'clock. They told them to scan above. They told them to corkscrew when they saw tracer. The gunners did what they were told. The bombers exploded anyway. Paul Mahle's cannons were never seen. The crews never knew where the fire was coming from. By the time Bomber Command admitted the weapon existed, the war was almost over. The slanted music had been playing for 2 years, and the men dying to it never heard the song.